Every day, you essentially pay your dues by doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. Okay. What are the different factors that might be contributing to these really high ankle injuries, or these rates of ankle and foot injuries? Okay. The biggest thing is going to be the forces of gymnastics. Okay. The forces of gymnastics are astronomical. They're very, very high. Okay. So a couple really good kind of foundational studies that looked at the forces of gymnastics or have been useful to understand what happens to the athlete's body is going to be Bruggerman in 1999, McNitt and Gray from 1994, and then the textbook from Gemini in 2020, as well as the textbook from Kane in 2013. And again, these are all in the show notes. You can check those out. But these are really great compilation studies that show some of the highest forces that have been recorded with lab settings or other ways. And keep in mind, these are controlled settings and they're not really like in the wild, so to speak, of somebody landing awkwardly or short. So if you hear these numbers and your eyes raise, you got to remember that there's even more probably beyond this that we can't measure yet, right? So say landing a 2.5 on vault, right? Or landing a double on floor, or landing a laid out half and half out off high bar, for example. The forces are probably actually much more than we know because we can only record so many things, right? But 15 to 18 times body weight is one of the higher numbers that we see when we look at some of these injuries, right? So that's a ton of force, right? It doesn't mean straight up that's happening every single time going through. It's a range here. And it's also a ground reaction force type measurement, which is going to be different than, say, someone's just like raw force output. But that, keeping in mind, that's a massive amount of force that goes through the ankle, right? And a massive amount of force that goes to the lower body. So those forces are real. Those forces are really high and the forces are really extreme. And I think sometimes in gymnastics, we don't see the external load. Say, for example, if you put a barbell with weights on it, or you saw somebody throwing a heavy object or landing with heavy momentum under a barbell, for example, we don't see those same numbers, quote unquote, on plates or something like that. So it's hard for us to conceptualize about what's going on. But when you see someone land, those forces are going through them every single time. So we can see both how we have an overuse injury rate, which is actually the highest amount of injury rates we have is in these overuse type injuries, not these one-off accidents in the ankle. Those happen too. But a large majority of the forces in gymnastics cause overuse injuries, so that about 70% of some of our injuries are coming from just repetitive overuse and micro trauma. They're not these accidents, which are unfortunately just part of gymnastics. Okay, it's a huge issue still with year-round training, right? Where we train all year round, and we also have early specialization where these athletes are doing just one sport from a very young age. If you look at the literature, sometimes athletes specialize as early as 4, which is insanely young compared to other sports. And having that yearly that yearly training happening all year round, and then also having early specialization, what it creates is repetitive forces, right? So say, for example, you take a young athlete who does soccer, and they also do swimming, and they also do gymnastics, maybe up until the age of 8 or 10. They have a lot of variety in the forces that their bodies experience. Swimming does not have these high impact forces. Running does a little bit, for example. So maybe that's not the best example in soccer, but say, for example, they play softball, right? And they also do swimming and they also do gymnastics for a couple of years when they're younger. It allows a robust athlete profile to be created, but it also spares them of the really high repetitive forces when they're young and their growth plates are open. Okay. And so we want to try to maybe encourage or have the conversation around what it would look like if we didn't have so much early specialization in gymnastics. Would we possibly be able to have a much more comprehensive profile of an athlete up until the age of 8 or 9 or 10, which is still, just for the record, it's insanely early to specialize versus 13, 14, 15. And I understand that gymnastics has different parameters around the elite level or around college scholarships. So I'm not going to take my coaching hat completely off and not say you shouldn't only do gymnastics at an earlier age. But that said, specializing at 4 or 6 or 8 really robs somebody of a massive opportunity to spare their body in high forces, but also to allow them to create a nice comprehensive skill profile and athletic profile that later they could possibly go on to be 14, 16, 18, 20 plus and continue high level gymnastics all the way through their entire career versus just maybe burning out early. And I think the research that we've started to do in like the Achilles tendon rupture situation or others really does show us that a lot of the issues between ages 10 and 14 related to injuries or burnout or mental pressure or, overuse really is a serious cause for concern that we want to check out. So if we want to have a really honest conversation, and we want to really make a positive dent once and for all, we have to understand the influence of year-round training. And we also have to understand the influence of early specialization on some of these injuries. And if you look at the literature, Istvan Ballier is probably the most famous here, but many other great literature and researchers show the significant dangers or risks that come to mental, physical, and emotional health when you have someone who's training one sport at a young age year round and never has a break. And so if you look at those position papers, particularly from, the International Olympic Committee or many other nice foreign, national governing bodies, they show us that these things are problematic. And unfortunately, gymnastics culture is a tad stubborn here, where we aren't willing to maybe risk trying a different opportunity here. And so I don't want to belabor the point, but that is a really brutal reality, is that those conditions of year-round training and early specialization create thousands and thousands and thousands of impact repetitions on the athlete's ankles. And I think that's why we see such high rates of things like stress fractures or cartilage issues or Achilles tendon injuries, right? Because there's never a time for us to dial back a little bit, do some cross training, take some time away from the high impact, and get these athletes through puberty safely to set them up well for the later in their career. Okay. Is that we know that proper landing technique is also something that must be changed in gymnastics. Okay. So Tim Hewitt is a really good researcher in the knee here, and he has shown a significant reduction in risk of injury, multiple fold, if we have proper landing strategies. But also, if you look at some of the research from Kane and others, when you look at the landing patterns that are used, improper landing patterns put quite a bit more stress through the ankle joint and through the Achilles tendon in particular. So understanding how to land in a way that allows proper absorption of forces, we'll talk about later, but also trying to not land on one side of the body more than the other with asymmetrical landings or one-legged landings, that helps mitigate the forces. And it helps, in a broad point of view, what we're trying to do is spare the joints and spare some of the tendons, the ligament complexes that are maybe not as capable to handle all those forces. So by landing in a way that has your feet hip width apart and has a proper squat and has proper tracking, what we do is we shift a lot more of the demand on the muscles, which is something that not only are designed to handle those forces, but they're also something that we can improve upon their capacity to handle those forces. Okay. So if we get stronger and we land in a proper technique, we have more of the ability to share that load across multiple areas of the body. So the calves, the quads, the hamstrings, the glutes, the core, and multiple joints are involved, versus if we land in that traditional style of gymnastics, which is very upright torso, very knees together and hips together, and very knee dominant landing. It puts the risk on the ankle joint and the knee joint for a lot of pressure, but it also accumulates a lot of extra wear and tear on the joints themselves because of those ground reaction forces not being shared equally. So proper landing technique and proper skill technique are also going to be very, very important in our discussion here. As you have this base layer of bones that are very intricately stacked together that allow for not only high forces to be absorbed, but also push off and absorption forces in the foot, so you can run and sprint and point your toe and jump and all that. Okay. When the motion of the foot going up and down is happening really, really smooth, it's usually the talus joint on top of the mortise joint. So it's called the talar joint itself going up and down. Okay. So then below that, when you have motion side to side, okay, it's going to be called the subtalar joint. Okay. So you have two different joints that are kind of going up and down together, and you have to make sure they work and they glide really smoothly to allow proper movement of the foot. All right. Now, beyond that, if you look at layers of the layers of the foot, this concept comes from the hip joint. So I apply it everywhere, from Peter Drayovich's works. But the different layers of the foot you can think about are bones, which is one we just talked about. The next layer out is going to be different ligaments or different capsules. Okay. So different, ways to kind of keep these bones snug to each other. So I'm not going to go through all the ligaments because it's literally exhausting. You could have a full semester course on this anatomy, which many people have. But essentially, you have some important ligaments on the inside, the outside of the foot, and many others, right? So on the outside of the foot, connecting that foot bone to the shin bone, you have your ATFL, which is kind of a more commonly known as the anterior talofibril ligament. And many people know this ligament because it's highly involved in ankle sprains. On the inside of the ankle, you have deltoid ligament, which is the opposite, which also prevents the foot from rolling inward. Okay, so you have these big meaty ligaments on the outside and inside of your ankle connecting your foot to your shin bone. And then also you have ligaments between those two bones, those tibia and the fibula, which also help cause a prevention of maybe some bowing forces between these two bones. They're kind of called syndesmoid ligaments sometimes, or different versions of those ligaments. And they essentially help to prevent some of the twisting or shearing forces between that. So you have the inside and the outside ligaments. You have many smaller ligaments that are involved as well, called like your CFL, for example, in an ankle sprain. There's a lot of ligamentous structures and joint capsule structures, which are essentially just like saran wrapping or balloon type wrapping around the ankle joint to kind of keep fluid in there and keep it from staying nice and snug. So the capsule itself is around the ankle joint, all those complexes I just talked about, like the tibiofemoral, the tibia and the femur coming. So when we have that little piece of it, right, we have that joint capsule that's coming together. We have some components that are very important to wrap in some saran wrap around those bones and provide joint fluid. Okay, so the capsule is wrapped around the ankle joint itself, right? The talus, the calcaneus, the tibia, and the fibula all connecting together has this saran wrap around it with synovial fluid, it's called, that helps to kind of just get fluid throughout the joint. It hydrates the joint for nutrition, but it also allows for some gliding to happen between these bones so that up and down and side to side movements can happen. Okay. So we have ligaments on the inside, the outside. We have the ligaments on the front of the ankle as well that connect the shin bones to the lower ankle bones. And there are tons and tons of ligaments that go between all of the bones that I just mentioned, right? So between the navicular or the cuboid or the metatarsals. And I'm not going to exhaust everybody and bore them by going by the names of all these things, but just keep in mind that you have a lot of ligaments that connect the bones together to themselves, which means that they're very vulnerable to be strained, right? They're very vulnerable to be maybe irritated when somebody lands or somebody does high force. Okay, so there's lots of ligaments between the foot bones. There's ligaments connecting the ankle bones to the foot bones. You have a notable ligament called your Liz Frank ligament, which is in your first and second toe, which many people may land on toe and cause some injuries to those ligaments. But we're going to go through the ones that are important as it relates to injuries as we go farther. Okay, but I don't want to exhaust everyone and bore everyone. Just keep everyone in mind that you have your ankle ligaments all together and a joint capsule that wraps around and has synovial fluid. So when, say, sometimes you land short, for example, or you crunch your ankle, you can irritate a lot of the ligaments in the front of the ankle, and you can also irritate the joint capsule and cause some swelling and some irritation and that pinch feeling because maybe you've caused some bone bruising on top of the ligaments themselves getting damaged. All right. So thinking about major muscles is probably the next layer. So layer 3, right? Bones, and then ligaments and capsule are 2. So bone is 1, ligament capsule 2, muscles is 3. Kind of the big hitters here, right? On the back of the leg, most people are familiar with the gastrocnemius muscle and the soleus muscle, which blend into the Achilles tendon. They come down and they kind of insert on the heel. And then you could argue that it wraps around to cause plantar fascia also being as well, which is the bottom of your foot, which is just this large, dense, thick connective tissue that helps support the arch. It's more of a ligament or a fascial complex, but I think it's important to highlight how important it is in relation to the motion of your ankle going into toes up when your Achilles is being stretched. Okay, so you have your Achilles tendon inserting and then kind of wrapping underneath. Okay, the tendon of the Achilles tendon obviously is pretty notable in the ligament and tendon section, but I think that it's important to kind of tie it together with the calf. It's kind of a recipe for someone to have really, really high force contractions on the heel. So the heel, the calcaneal insertion point is called Sever's disease, or calcaneal apophysitis is the geeky term for it. And apophysitis just returns to inflammation of the apophysis. The apophysis is the growth plate. So calcaneal, heel, growth plate, inflammation. That's what it kind of all comes together for those Latin aficionados out there. Okay, so that's kind of going to be the most common one that people hear about is Sever's disease or the growth plate irritation of the heel. Another smaller one just to mention is Insland's disease, which is a growth plate irritation of the outside foot bone, the fifth metatarsal. You have muscles that attach, the perineals attach to that and stabilize the foot. You have a growth plate there that also is sometimes slow to close in athletes, and that can also be a repetitive pulling from using jumping and landing. That can be pulled on and cause some growth plate irritation as well. So Insland's disease will be the metatarsal apophysis irritation, whereas Sever's disease would be the calcaneal apophysis. All right. So those are the next ones. And then the next ones that I put up are going to be tendinopathies. So this is essentially going to be irritation or repetitive damage to the tendons themselves. And the reason I put this next is because typically I see the same type of injury caused, right, by different age groups staying with an athlete across their life. So when they're young and they're in the growth plate situation, the growth plate is the vulnerable thing. As the growth plates close, but the forces stay the same, they keep training. The next thing that comes more problematic is going to be the tendon itself. Okay, so the tendon, like the Achilles tendon, for example, now becomes the irritated spot instead of the growth plate in the heel because the force is now shifted to the Achilles tendon. Okay, and then when they're older, that kind of tendinitis, that tendinopathy, unfortunately sometimes becomes a full rupture or a full tendon tear, which is what we see a lot in the older years of gymnastics or in the college gymnastics setting. And so I worry that sometimes the growth plate injury is correlating to a tendinitis when they're in high school and is correlating to possibly a tendon failure rate when they're in college. And so we have to keep in mind all these common forces, right? These common things we talked about in terms of what we can do to fix it. Those are going to be really, really important to kind of track throughout the entire year and multiple years in a row to make sure we're on top of those things. Okay. So tendinitis, it refers to inflammation of the tendon, whereas tendinopathy typically tends more to like a kind of a chronic degenerative process of the tendon. And for anyone who's looking for really great research here, particularly in the Achilles tendon, Jill Cook and Kyle Docking are really great researchers here. They have a phenomenal amount of information on kind of treating tendinitis like a continuum, right? So in the knee, it's patellar tendinitis, but in the ankle, the biggest one is Achilles tendinitis. So kind of treating on a continuum from maybe that acute, really hot, irritable tendon when somebody has an acute irritation, down the continuum to maybe more of a chronic degenerative or repetitive overuse type issue when the tendon starts to lose its ability to handle force and it becomes repetitively irritated. And then lastly, that full-on rupture, like an Achilles tendon tear. I personally like to recommend 4 phases, like generally that I teach athletes about and coaches and medical providers about, which is a little bit more easy to wrap your head around. So 4 phases. Phase 1 is what I call the damage control phase, which is the acute phase. So it's really just kind of like putting the fire out, quote unquote, right? Like doing whatever you need to do to calm the joint down, to get the swelling out, the pain out, just stabilize things a little bit. That usually, like I said, lasts between like anywhere from 0 to, some people say 2, but I would say up to about 4 weeks or so. For some people, some more serious injuries like a surgery, 6 weeks. Okay. The second phase is going to be what I call just being a normal human again, right? So can you go up and down the stairs? Can you get off your crutches? Can you sit for a long time or comfortably cross-legged? Can you walk for long periods of time? All that kind of stuff. That's usually the intermediate phase for me. And that I say lasts anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks up to about, 12 weeks, depending on the injury. And then you have the next phase, the third phase, is being a general athlete again. Okay. So just be generally athletic. And what this means in the advanced phase is what this correlates to is, can you, with weight or with general body weight capacity, squat, lunge, step up, jog, skip, light hop, skip, all those kind of things together, those kind of just general athletic things that everybody should be able to do if they want to participate in sports. That's when you build those things. And that usually happens anywhere between like the 10-ish week mark to about the 12 to 14 to 16 week, depending on the injury, sometimes up to about 5 months or so, depending on if you had a surgery, like an Achilles rupture. Right. And then lastly is going to be a gymnast again, which is the return to sport phase, which is usually anywhere from like the 3-month mark, if it's a mild sprain or it's not that bad, or it's, something easy, even 8 weeks for some things that are really, really mild, all the way starting like the 5 to 6 month mark for a surgery and kind of going out past that. That's when you really get that slow progression back to sports. And you have to really be methodical about how we slowly add in what skills. And I'll go over that. But essentially we're trying to break up those 4 phases to educate somebody on what's going on. But we also have to factor in that sometimes what is medically cleared is not the same as ready for gymnastics. And I think this happens quite a bit, is that doctors are amazing. I have so many friends that are surgeons and doctors and are awesome and mean well, but sometimes, unfortunately, they don't know gymnastics. And they say, oh, you're cleared, you're good to go. And so you have an ankle injury or a fracture and you've gone through 8 weeks of healing and rehab, but you're just like completely in the water by yourself, figuring out how you get back to gymnastics, right? And so what happens there is somebody jumps back too fast. They go into it too quick. They don't have the strength or that slow progression back, and they kind of flare their ankle up or they flare their tendinitis up, and it gets frustrating again. So it's important to remember that sometimes what medically cleared is not the same thing as cleared for gymnastics, because, medically cleared might be that the bone is healed, the ligament is repaired, the cartilage is the bone plug is healed in from a surgery. Whereas ready for gymnastics means mentally and physically, you feel completely ready to go back and do all your skills, which we know is very, very different. Okay. So sometimes you'll see things like, lower grade muscular strains or grade 1 ligament sprains, which is grade 1 just means irritation, 2 means micro tearing, grade 3 means a full rupture. So lesser degree tears, grade 1 sprains, usually might honestly take like 2 to 4 weeks. Could just be very, very low level irritation, versus the higher degree strains, maybe grade 2 ligament issues, the start of bone irritation, growth plate inflammation, cartilage bone bruising, landing short causing issues are a little bit more severe. It could be in the 4 to 8 range. And then you have things that are much more severe, like, partial muscle tears, Achilles ruptures, grade 3 ligament tears, stress fractures, OCD surgeries, fractures that need pinning or stabilization. Those obviously are more severe. They take much, much longer. So those can be in like the 3 to 6+ month range, up to like 9 months for cartilage, because they're just realistically, they're a lot slower to heal. Muscle and ligament sometimes heals much faster, and tendon heals faster than, say, bone or cartilage, for example. So those are just some timelines to think about. And then